Discover how smarter project insights can lead to better project outcomes.
Hello, project people. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Project Chatter podcast. It's always great to have you with us. If you haven't already hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast player, do so. And also check us out on YouTube, where you can watch us and stalk us and follow us and maybe see our guests as well. Why not? Dale, you've got a big event coming up. Please tell us about it.
Yeah, well, by the time this podcast goes out, the event will have been done in London. But yeah, we will hopefully have had a massive free networking gathering, and we'll keep you posted for the next one as well, folks, in the UK. But Val was just joking about stalking us. Please don't stalk us. But I do have a question for you listeners. If anyone has seen Martin, because he's gone AWOL on this episode, it's his turn. Last time Val went missing, but it's Martin this time. Val, any ideas where Martin is?
Have no idea. He's probably already at the pub, I would say.
Setting up.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Let's get into this today's pod. We will share some information about this event later on, but this isn't about us. This is about Joe Lucas. Joe, thanks for joining us today. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
No, not a problem. One, can I say congratulations on the topic title for this? Some of these words I haven't really heard before, and I love to get into the linguistics of it and how you kind of came about with these. But, you know, as usual with most of our pods, we love to hear about our guests, where they come from, where they've been, how do they land, where they landed, particularly in projects, because not everyone starts out going, I want to be a project manager or I want to work in projects, Dad. It's more of a kind of a progression over time, and you certainly traveled the world. So rewilding, did I say that right? Hopefully I did. Rewilding organizations. One, how did you end up in that position where you're rewilding organizations? And then the follow-up question is probably, what is it?
Yeah, the term rewilding is an attempt to look at how language is used. We are in a stage where we really need to shift how we operate and how we work. And we need a language that allows that to happen. And I suppose it's been quite a long and wild ride to get to this point in any case. But effectively, I work deep in what's generally called the shadow organization. So there's kind of things which are explicit, that you know, which are the rules of an organization. When you first join, they say, this is how we operate. And they tell you the governance routes, and they explain, you know, how you get things done. And then as you sit there for a while, you start to realize that there's an entire different set of rules that run underneath the surface. And recently I've been reading a lot of books around the idea that trees can actually talk to each other. And it really struck me, this idea that for that ecologists are only just getting their heads around the role that the fungi plays, mycelium, that sits between the roots of trees. And I probably get this completely wrong when I explain it from an ecologist point of view, because that's certainly not my background. But as they explained how this works in books like The Mother Tree, Finding the Mother Tree, or there's quite a few out there at the moment, which are just brilliant and worth reading. But it really struck me as the project manager and someone who's worked within those shadow organizations forever, is that we've got something similar going on inside our own organizations. And it's almost like, you know, I work within the mycelium, and we all know what that is. You know the fact that, oh, actually it's Fred that you go find if you need to get that crane hired, or the only way that you ever get anything into the boardroom is if you know the PA really well and they let you, you know, pass your paper through them, and these are all these hidden ways that organizations work. But the rewilding kind of came about on the concept that projects, like, I don't know if you've been in this situation, but when projects or an organization is sitting at that sort of 50 people or so, they start to get a bit messy. You know, things that used to work because you knew everybody who was there and you had a kind of routine and you didn't need that many processes or anything, and you're all feeling quite comfy. And then suddenly it's like, oh, just a second, who does that? Or who's that new person in the office? Oh, wait a second, how does this work anymore? And just for the entirety of my career, what we've done is we've kind of thought at that moment, you need processes. So it's good management consultants, in you come, and you put a whole stack of processes in. But the reality is that those processes are actually are trying to deal with, like, you're trying to replace relationships with process. And it's a really messy way of working. And in reality, actually, what we need to do is just take a much more structured approach to how relationships work. And if you take a more structured approach to how relationships work, I mean, we'd like to think that it should be easy. Relationships should be easy, but we work at our marriage and we work at our friendships. You know, we need to work at those relationships at work as well. You need some sort of structure around that. And so from my point of view, it's a bit like rewilding. We're trying to get back to a relationship-based approach, even when it's 7,000 people trying to deliver something like High Speed 2. So a very long experience of rewilding.
No, it's perfect. And I want to just add to that. I mean, I love the idea of the mycelium approach. It's the second time I've heard it, actually. Dave Snowden, episode 33. I've got it etched in my mind, Dale. He also mentioned about the difference between formal and informal networks, and he mentioned mycelium as the informal network. And I would love for you guys to be introduced to each other because he's a lovely guy. The other one is, you probably know this guy, the mushroom guy, Paul Stamets. He's got a Netflix special on, I think it's fungi, something about the mushrooms and how between the mycelium, they can share nutrients between trees and communicate, almost like a neural network. And I was like, oh my God. So my head had kind of mini imploded when I watched that. But anyone who is interested going down the rabbit hole with Joe, please check that out. I also want to know about your career, Joe. I want to know about you, the person behind the Shadow organization. Oh, that's so good. It sounds like a Ninja Turtle movie, but what is Joe doing? I mean, how did you get to a point where this is kind of what you're doing with your work and your career? Did you start in this area, or did you start in something else completely different and then switch? Tell me about you, Joe.
Well, my career was utterly planned, and it's gone exactly the way it was meant to the entire way through. As any
Exactly.
career does.
Yeah, of course.
Well, I think it all started with watching a movie. I can't remember. It's one of the Apollo movies, and I don't know if you remember it, but they basically put them in a room, and I think the lunar module was become disconnected from the main module, and they have to put them together. And classic silos working. You had one had a round and the other one had a square, and they're like, blast, these two things don't fit together. How do we fix this? Oh my God, that just the idea of being in a room and having to try and solve a problem like that was like, who gets to do that type of work? And of course, it's engineers. And so I happily signed myself up to become an aeronautical engineer. I love the way people choose their careers. I was sitting in a movie theatre and choose my career on this basis. But so I went to University of Queensland, and thankfully they do the first year as a common year. And I come from a family of builders, and obviously that seeped into my bones somewhere along the way, because the concrete and steel and how things fit together side of things interested me a lot. And when things stay stationary, I found it quite unnerving, the whole mechanics side of things when things kept moving. I was much happier with stationary objects. So so I ended up going towards civil engineering and graduated as that, and ended up in Arup as a graduate engineer. And then decided, like most graduates in the Brisbane office of Australia, that we all want to head to the UK at some point. So I managed to wangle my way across into the UK. But what had been happening is that right from the beginning, I ended up on mega projects. So I accidentally chose to be a civil structural engineer, primarily because I loved the guy who ran that department. He's an absolute star of a man. He knows his bridges back to front. And he's a superb boss. Like, he just knew how to teach people. He just never answered any of your questions. He just kept asking you more questions until you had that kind of, I get it now. And then off you go and scribble away some calculations. So I chose him rather than the profession, but quite enjoyed building bridges, etc. But that department happened to do mega projects. And we used to do exchanges with London in order to do work in Singapore on the Northeastern Line extension. And I was beam girl and there was column boy, and we just spent months and months and months designing the same thing over and over and over again. And I remember this one day I walked over with my sort of my pad where I had my beams on it, and I overlaid it over top of column boy's columns, and they didn't even, never the twain shall meet. And it was just like, oh my God. we've been designing at different directions for God knows how long. Never even occurred to us he'd been dealing with the trains that kept moving, so he kept having to move his columns. And I've got no idea where I was getting my data from, but it certainly wasn't coming from him. And
oh my God.
it really, I ended up, I wrote an algorithm to do my beam calculations, and then I got on with ISO 1000 and whatever it was at the time, putting a QS system in, or a quality system in, into the Brisbane office. And I used to do the handover with the UK with a really great bloke over there. And we got on really well. So when I came over to the UK, he kept saying to me, oh, you should be a project manager. Like, you really, this engineering lark, come over to the dark side. And I was working at Arup Associates at the time with the architects, etc. And I had a particularly bad day where I think we spent the entire day just choosing the color of glass. I'm like, oh, this is just pointless. As my career got down to choosing the color of glass. And so I shifted over into project management. And he sort of happened to walk past on that day in those sort of serendipitous moments that you have in your career. And I'm like, right, I'm ready to go to the dark side. And so I joined project management. At that point, this will date me. Project management was quite a new thing. We were just trying to figure out what was it, how did it work. You had to do all of it. You were like, you did your own risk registers. You did your own programs. You even did half of the QSing. It's sort of, you very much had to have your finger in all the pies. And I really enjoyed that, and moved to a company called the Nichols Group. And they're a family-based company. They're the closest I could find to Arup from, that sort of family feel and that really strong culture. But that got project management, because it was a really new thing in Arup at that point in time. And what I really wanted to do is I wanted to be with the client. I hated this idea that you sat in an office and you're trying to project manage something that you couldn't do the relationships. And I suppose that was fundamental to me, is this constant understanding of it was more than just a risk register or a program it's to get these complex projects working. You really need to dig under the surface and understand who's involved and who's really doing the work. I call them hidden voices, or in social network analytics, you tend to call them key influencers or connectors. And it's just finding, there's a brilliant company called Innovisor, and they do social network analytics, and they've got this rule called the 3% rule. And it's something we all know from Twitter. It's kind of like 3% of the people within your network are influencing the 90%. And it's not to say it's always the same 3%, depends on the topic, it depends on what you're trying to do. But there's this very small cadre of people that you need to bring along if you're going to create change. And so I ended up working in what was called Metronet at the time, which was trying to upgrade half of the London Underground. I was very, very green, didn't have a clue what I was doing. I'd landed supposedly to work for somebody and provide a bit of support. But, basically in the week that I arrived, he was walked out the door. And I mean, he was quite an influential person, because he turned around to me and he just said, look, you can do this role. I'm like, I don't even know what this role is. How can I do it? How does this work? No, you really just trust yourself, step forward and take it on. Just take it on. And so I ended up setting up and running what's called the Access and Logistics Department, which pretty much was the reason why people on the underground didn't get to ride for years and years and years on end on weekends, because there were blockades. I was the one sort of planning those forward into the future. And because I knew nothing, absolutely nothing, I really had to just figure it out as I went along. And the only thing I could do is go talk to lots of people. So I just talked to one person, and that would lead me to the next person. And at the beginning, my questions were, well, what is access and logistics? Like, what happens here? And it's like, oh. And then it was basically like every single piece of £4 million worth of work per day has to make it onto the railway. And it can only do that in these tiny little windows at nighttime. Like, you've got 3 to 4 hours where you may get an hour's work if you're lucky. And then you've got the weekends, and you're not allowed to do that very often. You've got to really negotiate to get those, because that just annoys half of London every weekend. So Transport for London were very tight about, we don't want to close constantly. And what turned up is all roads led to this one guy whose name was Richard, and he lived in the basement at Hogan. His job was to hand out a ticket that said, you can go on the railway. So basically gave the number. And like, he was really experienced. It's like, the guy had worked across the railways and he knew his trains and he knew how to close the railway in various ways. But he was deciding who got onto the railway based on his own knowledge and based on who filled in his forms correctly. He was completely oblivious to the fact that there was an entire department whose only job was to work out strategically which piece of work needed to go first. And so he was letting lots and lots of track work happen. And there was an entire signaling piece of work where the guys, they didn't know to the last minute they needed a closure. Track it, signaling is really a big bang type thing. So it's messy, messy, messy. It's an IT type project. Messy, messy, messy until the moment they need. And then they're like, oh, blast, we actually have to get on the line to do this bit. And they never remembered to actually book it until the last seconds. They drove this poor guy, Richard, nuts. So he never gave them any space. So you've got the entire boardroom going ballistic. They're like, we're paying a fortune for strategic planners. And, why is this entire project not moving? And you find out that there's one bloke who, utterly unintentionally, a really solid performer. Like, there's nothing, he was working his heart out to try and make all this work. But one person was running this entire project. And that just blew my brain, because I really got a fundamental feeling of, you need to find these key influencers, these hidden voices. And actually, they're rarely who you think they are. They're your document controllers. They're your commercial one who signs off the timesheets. They're the PA to the board that signs off the governance routes. They're your technical geek who doesn't want to talk to anyone else because they just want to do their technical stuff. But actually, they're the ones who sign off all of the technical drawings and keep all the engineers confident that what's happening is right. And so that's been the way I've been moving ever since, is I land on a project and I look for those key influencers and I co-create with them, which is where the name for our company ended up coming from. I worked on projects like Metronet, and then left from there onto the Olympics, where we were looking to try and get all the bridges across. So that was a lot of sort of partly access and logistics, partly just a whole lot of contractors in a really tight space. So lots of relationship management of who's going to clean the road. And I mean, it gets down to those basic things like who's going to clean the road was causing mammoth delays in the project. And people would be like, well, this is an important issue. And it's like, well, it is, because safety reasons, they can't move their trucks. So therefore nothing moves. And and they're really easy problems to solve. But there's just this massive gap between the people in the treetops who are making decisions and the people in the mycelium who are getting on with their day job. And worked on out at Heathrow. And then more recently, I've been working on the relationship between Transport for London and High Speed 2. And that's been deeply fascinating, because you effectively have two behemoths. One's like a mega startup, all these hundreds and hundreds of companies coming together to try and build what is a ridiculously ambitious and complex railway from, at this point, London up to Birmingham. And then you have Transport for London, the old grandma who's been there forever, has sort of got all these arms and legs that, and it's a bit of an unusual situation for TfL to be in, Transport for London to be in, because they're not party to this one. Whereas Crossrail, they were in the thick of it. They're one of the partners. On this one, they're just being impacted by it. There's going to be disturbances for 15 years, say 10, 15 years during the build process, lots and lots of lorries thrown onto the roads. They've got to upgrade Euston Station to deal with the extra capacity of people that are going to come in. But TfL doesn't have a seat at the table in the most traditional sense. They're definitely a third party. So I've been looking at everything, the relationship between the two, from everything from the contractual, what are the legal requirements between the parties, right the way through to what are the processes, and then what are the relationships that need to happen. And when you think about those two parties, one, they certainly don't have the same aims. One's trying to build really fast, and one is trying to, keep London moving how best they can. These are two very opposing themes. And you can't change either of them. They're too big to say, you need to work to my way. They're very used to being the party who says to the other party, you must work in my way. This is the only way it works. when you've got two big behemoths like that, they really can't shift. It's as much as they can yell at each other, that won't happen. And so what we had to do, and I find this highly amusing, I call them bridging processes. So I started in bridges, and now I've built bridges between these big organizations. And all you do is you just sort of tie together, this is how you normally work. 90% of it still works perfectly fine. And then here's a little bridge between you that makes sure that at the beginning of each piece of work, we're really clear on how you're going to operate together and that you're working in accordance with the legal obligations. But also, as much as anything, the relationships. So we actually name, who's the key person on this? Who do you need to keep on the journey with you? And you tie it into the document control system, and you tie it into the commercial system, and you tie it into the planning system. And in that way, it can live and breathe. And you do it through these interactive forms, and that allows it to grow and continuously learn as it goes along. I've got no idea where we started on this, but that's where I got to.
No, that's fantastic. See, this is why it's important, I think, for us to know the journey of everybody who comes on the show, because Dale and I are fascinated how people end up doing what they ended up doing. I mean, no idea before you started that you on the bridges and, Beam Girl and Column Boy, that's stuck in my head. And the whole element of taking some of your kind of previous experience and then applying that to your new roles. And I guess my follow-on question around that is, before I hand it to Dale, because I know he's got a few, what's the technique? Is there a big whiteboard? Are we doing this like old school project management where there's just this huge wall and we're all putting, process? I mean, there's some level of unpacking, I imagine, that your team or yourself does. How do you do that? And is there a technique that you follow?
There is, but actually what I'm finding highly amusing is that I'm a pure practitioner. So I'm a systems thinker, which I've only just recently really realized that's what it's called. But it does mean it's really hard for others to understand what's going on inside my head. And it does make it quite hard for me to articulate it using the language that we currently have in the project management world, because we don't talk in systems naturally as natural systems, human systems. I don't mean a system as a machine. I mean those wonderfully complex, ever-changing, self-organizing, wiggling masses, which is why I love the language of nature as a way of being able to talk about what this is. So can you still hear me properly?
Yeah.
Yeah, we still got you.
Yeah, sorry. Cool. And yeah, so
oh, we've got an issue in the room.
I think that the technique. Oh, can you hear?
I think we're getting you back. We lost you there for a few seconds, but I think you're back with us, Joe.
Okay. So in terms of technique, effectively, there's this concept of the 3%, which we spoke about earlier. Mm-hmm. And so you go in, you interview people. Invariably, within about 5-10 interviews, you start to hear similar stories from different perspectives. And that really lets you kind of narrow down, one, what the issue is, like what's kind of going on under the surface, where are the blockages, what's not quite working. You start to get a sense of it. But what you also get a sense of is who are the key players, like who are these influential people who are either blockers, knowledge keepers, they're just, causing disruption. You have a whole combination of positive, good, bad, indifferent. And generally it's not intentional on anyone's behalf. It's because something's happening in the system that's not letting them get their job done properly, or you've got someone isolated off somewhere. And I bring those people together and we work on the solution. It's like, how do you want to work? How are you actually working? Because what the reality is that we get this gap, this reality gap between what the process is saying and how it's supposed to be working and what's actually happening at the ground level. And so I sometimes think about myself like an anthropologist. You're really just trying to do a lot of listening and a lot of observing and a lot of trying to get under the surface. And then you start to see the patterns. And I suppose that's the way my brain works, is I start to see like, oh, actually, just a second, if we just tied this to this, or if we started to move this to here, or if we just pulled this in. And in reality, whilst it sounds incredibly complex, it really often boils down to a decent spreadsheet, which becomes your single source of truth. You almost always need to have a regular meeting, which is actually has to be a working meeting. It can't just be a nice to have meeting. You've got to be doing something really important there, which probably makes the worksheet, the spreadsheet work. And then you need to have clear, once you've agreed which way it's going to work, you start to write that down in very clear flow charts that people can actually use, not Visio ones that are just blow your mind. I'm talking step-by-step IKEA manual type thing. Anyone can pick it up and use it is the main aim. And that you have some pretty straightforward forms and things like that that are easy to fill in, that just make sure that you force the behaviors that people want to do anyway. They just get a bit caught up in the day-to-day and forget to do. And you just try and make people's, I often think about it like as if you're wandering through a forest and there's a whole lot of knotweed and you're like, right, let's just tear out the knotweed so we can see the path again. It's not like there wasn't a path. The path's there and people are trying their damnedest to get through it. But sometimes they're having to go all the way through the forest, and sometimes they're having to go, climb the trees to get out. And sometimes they just give up and sit down and go, well, the process, the pathway is supposed to be there. It's not there. Well, what can I do? Right, it's above my pay grade. I can't solve this problem. And so you're just there going, right, there's the bindweed. Let's tear that out. That's what I tend to call minimal interference. You try not to uproot the trees. Let's not think that the entire forest needs to be replanted just so that it can be in neat rows to make your life easy. Let's accept where the trees are. Let's see where the desire lines are, like the pathways people like to use, and let's give them a good clear out so that people can start moving along them properly. And actually this work, I did the TfL HS2 work as a consultant on my own, because you're utilizing the entire network, the whole project to make it work. So you don't need to go in big teams. When I first started my career, you'd go in with, huge numbers. And I was in PwC for a period of time. And it was just normal to go in with 15, 20 people and you'd be the experts and you'd tell them how to do it. Whereas I just rely utterly on the people who are in there and on their knowledge and on trusting them, trusting that they actually know how their business works and know many more layers than I do as to what the politics are. And my job is just to, start to see, I'm quite good at seeing the pathways despite the bindweed, and giving that a good clear out and going, is it that way? And they'll often go, oh my God, thank God we haven't seen that path for a while. And you kind of know you've got it right, because once they start moving down the pathways properly, they forget that it wasn't always like that. They'll really if I do my job the best I can, people will forget that I had anything to do with it. It's just like, well, of course, that's the pathway. We've always been on that pathway. That's the great pathway.
I love it, Joe. I love the way you're stripping it back and just, simplifying it for everyone. And the approach sounds really refreshing, because we've had a lot of discussion around processes and, technology and all these weird and wonderful new things that are coming our way that would improve project management and how we actually deliver. Yet what you're suggesting, I think, is just stripping it back a little bit and go, actually, what really matters and how do we see the wood from the trees? And I want to come back to what you said, I guess, at the beginning of the pod around processes versus relationships. And you build a very good analogy around, you build a relationship with your partner, with your friends, with your family, etc. And that's no different if you're working in a team, a project team. And I just wondered then, because ordinarily maybe you can't choose your family, but you choose your friends, you choose your partner, you typically court, or you'd hang around people before they become your friends and things like that. And I guess getting into a team, whether it's organizational team or a project team, you don't have that courting period. You don't have that adjustment period to figure out the relationships. Now, those listening to you going, okay, well, if I'm to create a team that works well and that has good relationships, is it about the hiring? Because then there's also the school of thought, well, if you hire people that typically get along, maybe you get groupthink and you don't get the diversity of thought. But maybe it's not about hiring. Maybe it's about having, as you say, the right catalysts or the key influences to bind all of that together. So this is just me thinking out loud as a bit of a brain vomit, maybe, if that's the right way to put it. But I want to come back to that because there's a place for processes as well. Let's face it, in certain instances, it does give us, we've said it before, freedom within this framework. So the framework is important, so we know kind of which general direction we're heading. But I think the glue that you're talking about, keeping that together, going the same direction, is actually what it is the relationship bit. Sorry, I don't even know if there's a question in that.
It's okay. A couple of things that are springing to mind as you say this. So one, I love the fact that we as humans love things to be binary. We love a this versus that.
Yeah.
There is no this versus that in this situation. It is processes and relationships. Processes certainly do have a place. I'm probably more inclined to call them frameworks or structures. And if you're a Brené Brown listener, she often talks about guardrails. And I really like the idea of guardrails. So you can do whatever you like, as long as you're inside those guardrails. It's pretty much how I parent. It's like they've got incredible freedom, and then it's like, don't you go over that line. And I'm probably pretty much the same at work, incredibly relaxed until the moment somebody steps over the line of just a second. That's outside of the rules we set up between us. I possibly refute the concept that you don't choose your colleagues, because we choose it in the culture we create that then attracts the people who choose to come to your company. And as much as we like to think that we've got it down to a fact-based process to bring people into our organizations and that it's all blind, whatever, the reality is that I'd say 80 to 90% of people who are hired through a friend of a friend or a mate of a mate or somebody who knows somebody, especially in the major projects world or even the projects world, where it is quite tiny really in reality. The number of phone calls you get going, do you know this bloke and are they any good, is pretty standard. So I think companies do attract certain people in. And so if you're finding that you've got a lot of poor relationships, I'd say it's the system, not the people. And I really do believe heavily in the concept that actually the behaviors that you see are heavily driven by the system. And that's really, we need to focus on that. We need to think, well, let's stop trying to blame any individual. It's let's stop trying to figure out how to make everyone friends. You don't need to be all friends. This is not the aim here. And actually you said something there, Dale, that really is something that I'm talking a lot about with people at the moment, is this idea of having somebody who is in the role of a connector, a relationship, like a therapist for work. It sort of feels like a necessary thing, and I'm laughing about it, but I'm actually deadly serious. I've got an image behind me, which is a tree, which is the first Bramley apple tree, and then the mycelium that sits underneath it, the root system. And we run our projects as if everything's above the line, that it's all the tree, and we don't run our projects as if there's anything going on underneath. We kind of hope that sorts itself out somehow. We may send our teams off for a bit of an away day, or we're saying they just aren't working hard enough, or they've got this issue. And instead of sitting back and going, actually, what's going on in our system that's enabling that poor behaviors to occur? Because people don't turn up to work to have poor behaviors or poor relationships. Actually, the vast majority of our strongest relationships do sit in our workplaces. We spend a huge amount of time there, often more than we do with our family or our friends. And it's not about, it's about being clear about who you are. I did a TEDx talk a couple of years back, which was called Superheroes and Sidekicks. And that was all about what you need to do as an individual to survive in the mycelium. I didn't call it the mycelium at that point, but the idea is surviving in these complex networks we work in. And the reality is that so we're given so little time to really dig into what's my superpower. Our entire education system is all about being an all-rounder. You've got to be good at everything, and you've got to fix the things you're not good at. And it's all about the hero mentality of I've got to win. And I just don't buy into that in the slightest. If you're going to survive in our complex world, one, you need to know what your superpower is. What is it that I uniquely do? What's my story? And what perspective am I bringing to work, including all the crap, like all the bits all your own personal issues that you've got from your upbringing and from the relationship you have with your dad or the relationship you have with brothers or whatever. No, I'm going for the males here. My very male orientated world that I live in. And we need to think, who are our teammates? Like, who's your sidekicks? Like, when you're kicking on all cylinders, who have you had around you? And that's not just at work. You also have a partner at home who, when you go off to do something mega at work, my God, are they doing some sidekick work? And also you're a sidekick for other people. There's plenty of times where you're, especially as a consultant, most of my time is as a sidekick to someone else. And so really recognizing this team concept, knowing who you've got to have around you to make you operate. And then it's about, I call it the power of 10. I love all these terms. We can't help ourselves. But, and then for this particular problem, who do I need to be working with? And what does that relationship need to look like? And some people call it kissing the frog, when it's that person where, for me, it's generally a lawyer. It's just like the bloody mindedness of a lawyer against the mind of an engineer. It's just never going to end well. But I spend half my life having to work with lawyers. And so there's always this element of, this is the perspective they're coming from. Whether I like it or not, I've got to have this conversation. It's probably going to be a bit uncomfortable. But the reality is without this conversation, this project can't move forward. So I don't need to be best buddies. And actually, generally, I like them quite well at the pub. It's just in that room when you're having one of those conversations about, we can change that word. This is not sensible. Yeah. It's like, but it doesn't have precedence in law. It's like, oh my God, I don't care what precedence is. What's the future? So yeah, you just recognize you're talking from very different standpoints, and that's fine. And it's having a bit of, Julia Middleton calls it cultural intelligence. And I love her concept of cultural intelligence in relationships, because I think it's fundamental. And she doesn't just mean culture in terms of different nationalities, although that certainly comes into it. It's culture from every aspect. So the lawyer versus the engineering mindset is a cultural difference. And she's just got, again, I love it. She's got a very simple rule on this. She's like, figure out what's core to you. Like, if you stopped doing this, would you stop being you? And then she says, flex everything else. And that's the only way you can have strong. So we don't get taught this stuff. You have to learn it.
No, I agree. And it's great. And that's why we talk to people like you to actually bring this to the surface. As you say, it's all underneath. And, and Val and I have spoken on previous episodes how we often felt that project controls or PMO had to kind of fill that gap and be that glue on a project, because we do touch all of the various elements and the various functions, the various departments, speaking to engineers about progress all the way through to your project manager and what you want to report and etc. And then bring that back up to the project director. And they have very different relationships to what we have as project controls. And so invariably we'd have to be almost sometimes that, as you say, that mycelium perhaps, and going, well, if you did this differently or looking at it through a different lens, then perhaps you'd have a different outcome. And I think that's an incredibly difficult skill to have, because as you say, it's relationships and it's understanding humans and individuals and building those relationships and actually taking the time out to actually know each other and understand each other. I also like your analogy or your story there about, in the boardroom or in the meeting room, you might have a bit of a debate, but at the pub, it's okay. My analogy is the rugby field. Between the start whistle of the rugby match and the end whistle, you're absolutely smashing each other. But then that final whistle goes, you go, well done, great tackle, let's go have a pint in the pub. And for me, that is what projects are about as well, because they are complex, they are pressurized, they are tough. But I think at the end of the day, those relationships will actually help you get through it as well. And so I love the fact that we're talking about project, we're talking about change, we're talking about how everything comes together, but we're actually going back to the human side of everything as well. And that is quite important. I just want to jump back to what you said a little bit earlier as well about building bridges and, your story about TFL and HS2 and, the one going back to your access days, finding out, was it Richard that sat in, the underground there, and figuring all of that stuff out and you going in as an individual and assessing it. Now, I just wonder, those listening out going, actually, that sounds pretty cool, where you go in and you assess and analyze, the ecosystem and how it works. And there's obviously certain skill you've picked up along your journey to identify and find little signs and triggers of what to look out for. Can anyone get into doing what you do? Or is it something that they have to go along a path and say, check this out, get a bit of experience in this and that before you come and try and do what I do? Just for those interested listening to go, actually, Joe, I really like what you do. How do I get into it?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I'd recommend reading Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems. I've actually done this the wrong way round. I've had to learn it all the hard way, make all my mistakes, and then read Donella Meadows and go, oh, is that what I was doing? So yeah, just cut out all the bit that I had to go through and just read Donella Meadows, because she puts it so well about what's going on. And I think it is something that can be learned. But what I do find is that I think there's a proportion of the population who are naturally systems thinkers. So if you find yourself a natural connector, you're the one that sort of ends up tying bits. And like what I find deeply interesting is I've got this crew of connectors around me nowadays that we've sort of grown over the years. And again, this is sort of across different companies, and we have all sorts of things, book clubs, and we have dinners, and we have all sorts of things that sort of sit around this. But it's sort of attracted all the connectors in the industry because they've heard somewhere, or even on my LinkedIn, I've said I'm a connector, and they've gone, oh my God, I'm one of those. So I think there might be a certain element of self-identifying. And also we come in all different shapes and sizes. So my particular skill set is to do with the technical function, like taking the engineers or the lawyers or the people who have really deep specialized knowledge, and tying that into the bigger system. So I'm almost taking the hidden and making it slightly more visible and tucking it into the visible mechanism. So I'm trying to tie them into the formal governance routes, so all that hidden stuff actually works. I prefer to just change the formal governance routes, but that's almost impossible. Invariably, you do need to just work with what's there and then just figure out where to tuck it in. Whereas I've got other people that I work with who, they're the political animals. They really get how to connect the politicians and how they operate in a policy level into a project so that they can support it and so that you get the proper stakeholder relationships. Very different skill set. I end up more in the process world, as in I have to create feedback loops. I need to create avenues and these pathways we talked about. I'm here slashing and burning my pathways and working deep in the forest. Whereas they're having cups of coffee, it's all, and actually doing seriously hard work whilst they have cups of coffee, because you cannot underestimate how much energy goes into emotional work. And it is a job, and it's one that's utterly unrecognized. So the people who do that work, one, I say hats off to you. That is serious work where you're working at that mind shift level, trying to get say a politician working with a delivery organization and managing those relationships such that if you're an actual therapist, you're only allowed to work something like 20 hours a week because it takes such a toll on you emotionally. Whereas we just take it as part of the day job, off you go sort out the relationship between these two parties. And if it's not hurting you that much, and if it's not sort of, then you're probably not doing the work. So in terms of can anyone do it, I think we need to have the specialists in this world. And I really don't want to pull them out of being specialists and into the connecting world if they're a proper specialist. We need everyone's skill set. But if you're sitting there thinking, oh, I'm a connector, that makes sense to me, like that's the sort of work I do, I'm always in the thick of these things from all different angles, then yeah, you can do this. It generally gets titled management consultancy. I never get hired to do what I do. I'm generally hired for, technical assurance or governance, or I don't know, just this is a Joe-shaped hole and we need a Joe in here is actually more likely to be how it ends up. You don't get hired to come in and do this. And I'd love that to change in our industry, that we recognize this entire invisible world and the fact that we need the connectors in all different shapes and sizes, managing the relationships and working out how these things work.
No, that's excellent. It's also a good insight to those listening. But the other thing you mentioned, and it's just one more before I hand to Val, you mentioned around key influences, and you said perhaps we need to have someone on the project that, looks for these, relationships and how they work. What are some of the tricks that you use to identify the key influences, if you may give away some of your secrets there?
No, it's not secrets at all. I think I've got a slightly odd brain, so it may have just been built that way.
You're in good company.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do. I went to a talk that was given on Bank Station by Simon Addyman, who I think is Dr. Simon Addyman nowadays. And he explained social network analytics, and
Pausing for dramatic effect, I think, Joe.
On Bank Station, which was, oh
There
my,
we go.
yeah, you're right. Yeah, so
Yep.
it's a series of circles all tied together with all these links. And it was just like seeing my brain up on a screen. It's like, my God, that's basically, that's what I see in my head, is all of these different connections and all these different people, and my brain's trying to find a structure through it of, wait a second, if we tied this one with this one. Because when you're dealing with like 7,000 people, there's just no chance that you're going to know everybody. You've really got to hone in on just the people. And also just talk to people. I mean, I'm such a talker, and I find it amusing that my greatest skill is active listening. It's like, I mean, talk about being given, I suppose they say all your skills sit on a spectrum. So I suppose, because to do my real work, I have to go in and, when I start a project, all I can do is talk to as many people as possible and hold really in-depth conversations to try and get under the surface. And I have to hold my tongue because I know nothing at that point. And then once I get my teeth in, I talk nonstop. But that's beside the point. So it's active listening, it's observing, it's paying attention. And actually, if your brain doesn't work in the odd way of creating its own social networks, use social network analytics. It is a tool, and it is a proven tool, and probably more reliable than my brain, for picking out who these key influencers are. They can actually just do simple surveys, and they can say, here are the connectors, and they can actually pick up all sorts of really fascinating information.
That's really insightful, Joe. And I think, we're nodding in the background because Dale and I have done probably similar things, but we didn't know what to call them. I think a lot of this subject matter has to be borrowed as you have from other fields. And I think there's something around cross culture, but cross collaboration between theories and knowledge banks. And we've had a lot of different people on this show, from actors to comedians to communication specialists to, not therapists, but people in the organizational change area. And they all bring fascinating insights and facets to project management. As you said, project managers are kind of, they're meant to have their fingers in all pies. I think that's kind of slightly changed over the last maybe 5 years. In particular, they're doing a lot less of the kind of doing work. They're more kind of facilitating the politics and the relationships. And I guess there's relationships, they don't go away. And so I really love your point around communicating and being a little bit of a therapist in terms of how you engage with these relationships. And one of the reasons I was interested in that is because I'm studying business psychology at the moment. I saw a talk by a guy, I think he's a Deloitte guy, and I never heard of a business psychologist before. And he gave this talk for this leadership training course I was in, Joe. And I walked out of that. I was like, this is amazing. All the stuff he talked about is what we're doing now. It's a bit like when you read that book on systems thinking. It's like, it all makes sense now. And just being able to categorize my own brain, because it's all just Post-it notes in there, Joe. And sometimes I need, you're nodding, so you're probably the same. We're just a bit of organization in there just to get it all working in the right format. But my question is probably around, you mentioned cultural intelligence. So can we break that into a little bit more of a understanding? Because I work in a space very similar, I think, where sometimes it is just a Joe role or a Val role. They're like, oh, well, we just need Val in here because it's not necessarily what he does, but he would be able to fix it and how he does it. And he'll be able to connect these guys with those guys and it'll work, which I don't mind doing because it's any problem's a good problem for a consultant, and I enjoy the challenge. But I think there's an element of culture that's not being recognized as a value set. So what I mean by that is I go into projects and they said, the team's not performing, we're not delivering results, we're not hitting the markers or the benchmarks, whatever they might be. And they'll look at the numbers and I'll say, well, what about the narrative? What about the story? What about the, as you said, the mycelium or the informal networks? How are they being developed? Are they not important? What's important, Val, is that we hit this day one of operations. That's what's important. So, yeah, okay. So I think there's a gap between culture and real results that's not being educated in project management. I'm just wondering, what's cultural intelligence do? How could that be helpful for people maybe listening who have that same problem?
I'm not sure if it's necessarily cultural intelligence, or that certainly helps because that is what is behind relationships. And just to give a little Julia Middleton moment here in terms of how you get to cultural intelligence, we started with IQ, which is how clever are you? And I think half the time our reporting stopped at the IQ stage. We kind of went, right, that's good enough for us. Let's just stay there. Yep. You can count those. I like counting things. So let's just count things. And we'll be fine. And then you move on to EQ, and that's, how do we get on with each other? And what Julia loves to say at this moment is, I'm really good. I've got great EQ. I can get on with, and they forget to put the end on the bit, which is people like me. And so she's like, CQ is, but can you get on with people who aren't like you? And that's a fundamental skill, to be able to reach across the boundaries and to be able to work beyond your authority. So there's the day job and what it says on the tin and what your job description says. I don't think I've ever worked to a job description. It's sort of like, well, that's nice. Now what actually needs to be done? And I think lots of people get trapped in their job description, and of course they get trapped in it. That's the route to, you work your way up the bands, you work your way up the hierarchy, and the whole aim of the job is to get to the top. And it's like, just to say, isn't the aim to deliver some things for people, who need to move around London, or who need to have clean drinking water, or who we kind of forget the end output of what we're doing this work for. And I think at this time, when we are in a climate and biodiversity emergency, we've got an IPCC report coming out that will tell us we've got no more than 4 years to fix this problem. If this isn't, if this isn't the most mega of mega projects, and so therefore, if this isn't the community to come forward and solve this problem, then what is? And if we keep having the wrong value set, as you call it, we're not going to fix this problem. This is not about when are we going to get on site with the climate emergency. It's like, no, this is not one of those problems. This has gone into such complex lands that, we're more in the Rumi world of take one step forward and the way will emerge. And you just have to trust that you take each step. And it's a lot of little steps, and it can't be the same people taking those steps. It's like we all need to take steps forward. And in order to do that, again, we go back to this idea of you need to know what your skill set is, because you have a lot more agency and you have a lot more influence than you actually believe. And we all have the ability to take that step forward within our sphere. And actually, if we do it collectively, if we start finding each other and working together as teams, this is a solvable issue. It is something we can, these are systems. So therefore, if you leverage the right point, you can get completely out of proportion change. But if we keep doing exactly what we've always done, that leads the road to madness.
Well, there's some good points in there. You've actually just sparked my interest, my philanthropic interests, because we do want to obviously talk about societal outcomes. And I think a lot of the times once we're removed, we're in a project, we just think about the project, but we don't realize that there's a societal impact for every project that we build, especially now. Particularly in Australia, I don't know if you've been watching, Joe, but we've got probably the biggest infrastructure and transport boom ever. But we're not necessarily linking that to societal outcomes, and some of them should be environmental. So I think the UK is starting to do this now. I saw the latest UK infrastructure pipeline report where they are linking built environment and natural system environments. They are, I think, looking how they kind of make their impact and contribute to things that don't just help them, but help the environment at large. We all have to get together, but I'll come back to you, Eliza, your sticking point around, there's the parties you mentioned, HS2 and Transport for London, that big that you just can't change them. And that concerns me around the environment when we talk about how we get people kind of to bring together. We need almost, transatlantic. We need people to have mycelium stretches across coasts, across countries and boundaries. That's a big stretch from where we are today with so much conflict in the world. And I don't want to get political, but how do we do that? What's your thoughts, and how can we help each other? Just, let's whiteboard today. Dale, get the whiteboard ready. We'll just spit out some ideas. I mean, we might spark someone who has the idea that does something about this that can help us bring this together, or it could be us, who knows. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Jo.
Yeah, well, this is how I ended up doing this exact exercise. Is how I've ended up leading a not-for-profit. So we're not doing it again.
Yeah. Oh, do mention it as well. Do mention you're not-for-profit. I love the idea too.
Well, it is exactly in this space. It was asking that exact question. In reality, it's quite amusing that we've ended up in that same place again. So it's obviously a problem that needs to be solved. So I run a not-for-profit called Ego to Eco. And it's the idea of shifting from an egocentric, we are the owners of a system approach, which is beautifully in a triangle, which reminds me always of the wonderful iron triangle of time, cost, quality, that traps us in quite regularly. Moving to a lovely circular economies, where we are a presence within, a regenerative presence within the ecosystem. We take our place as opposed to having control over it. And I really love this imagery. And at this moment in time, of course, I can't remember where it comes from, but it's this idea of shifting from ego to eco. And what I'm particularly interested in is what does it mean for you to shift from ego to eco? And I think what we're doing at the moment, that you're talking about TfL or HS2, yeah, they're really difficult to move. Really difficult to move. And actually you take that larger and you get to a government, yeah, really hard. It does. Because like, you've seen the changes over the years, and there are leverage points and there are moments of crises. But the reality is that all of those organizations and all of those governments, they're not things in themselves. You know, they are a series of a whole lot of relationships, and they're people, and they're us. We are the government, and we are those organizations, and we are part of that supply chain, and we have influence. So Ego to Eco is all about creating a space where we can come together across those boundaries. And discuss issues that we want to address. And we have a really simple format. We have this sort of sentence, which is, wouldn't it be amazing? Which comes from Karen Dark. And it's just, Danella Meadows talks about, we can't predict the future, which will put fear into the heart of any project controls person. But we can envision the future. And I love that concept of envisaging. And the whole problem is that we're a bunch of engineers and data techie people. We like facts and figures, but the things that are going to move us and shift us and change how we operate is actually at an emotional level. And we need to connect with people at an emotional level. And you can't do that from a negative point of view. So if the news is all just overwhelmingly, actually, I think I just prefer not to know. You know, yes, I'm going to drown, but let's just let that happen whilst I'm watching Netflix, and hope it's not too painful.
Yeah.
So the whole point is that it's just been crazy. We've just ended up, we're working with the artist Wolfgang Buttress, who did The Hive in Kew Gardens, as well as many other beautiful pieces of work. And he has a real passion for taking data. So The Hive in Kew Gardens actually feeds off the beehives in Kew Gardens, and the bees in Kew Gardens impact the way the lights work on the sculpture and on the music. The sounds of bees are actually infiltrated into the music, and the music's never the same because it's reacting to what's happening in the hive. So he has this beautiful way of connecting people at an emotional level to nature through data, which I just found deeply fascinating. And so incredible. Yeah, so we're working with him, and we're creating what's called a digital forest. And each tree in the forest, including its mycelium, of course, is around a wouldn't it be amazing statement. So a topic or an outcome focused idea. And those are being sponsored by different organizations. So we have people like KPMG and Arup and WSP and LLDC and many others who are, sorry, that's a lot of acronyms. That's the world we live in, but who are getting behind this. And what it allows is these conversations. So we run events where we bring people together and we ask this question of what does it mean to you to move from ego to eco? People envision their, wouldn't it be amazing? But what's equally important is what do they commit to do to making that wouldn't it be amazing work? And we work with them to help them understand what their skill set is, like who are they, what's their superpower? So when they're committing from a place of agency. So it's not just, I'll recycle my, my water bottles or things like this. It's not the government needs to do this, this, and this. Yes, sure, the government needs to do lots of things, but that's outside of your control. Let's focus on given the constraints that you're in at this moment in time, you know, what can you do? And as you're saying, the UK is moving ahead on this, and especially places like the Environmental Agency. And Joe Jolly's a very big advocate of the concept of, you know, we have the agency and we certainly have the urgency now, and we all need to step forward. So what we're trying to create is these communities of interest around these visions of the future, and it'll be an open platform that anyone will be able to go onto and be able to hear the stories, be able to experience the trees. Each tree is unique because it's shaped by the conversation that happens. And it actually is shaped by the diversity of the people involved. So the more branches, the more wild the tree, the more diverse the voices. So we're digging into all of our networks, and we're making sure we're getting youth voices, we're getting First Nations people, we are stretching across into trying to get down the supply chain to make sure that we really hear from apprentices and we hear from people on the front line. And you can turn up to one of these workshops and you could end up being there with a forester from Tanzania or a beekeeper from Mexico, and be holding this really interesting, diverse conversation that might shift your thinking a little bit. And then we ask you to share your story and we capture those stories, and that shapes the tree. So it's quite a wonderfully crazy event, but very exciting.
That is amazing, Joe. I don't know what to say. We'd love to help. If there's anything that Dale and I can do, obviously the platform's great, but you know, the more we can spread as it, you know, connect the mycelium and get people working together. I love the idea of creating buzz around you're using technology too, but you know, connecting natural systems with human systems and using that as a force for good. And I think, you know, we could do that on this platform. We know a lot of people now who would absolutely love to be involved. So if anyone's interested, I guess we'll send some details out on the show notes, Joe, so they can get in touch and contribute. Yeah. And we urge everyone to get involved. That's fantastic. Geez, wow. I love. There's a whole bunch of things you said in there as well. You know, and you went back to, you know, agencies. You know, having the agency, or even almost the permission to make change, but within your control. That you can do change within your control. And it's a bit like eating an elephant. You chunk it down, eat it one bit at a time. I don't know if you've heard that before, but you're a very interesting person, Joe, because obviously people who become engineers are interested in things, but you're very much interested in people and things. And so I think, you know, maybe it is unique to your personality, but a very, very important personality, I think, for the future of this planet and the projects that we work on. So thanks for being here. I had one more question, and then I'm going to hand off to Dale. So we talked about, and this is going back into the detail, I do apologize. After finishing it with that, you'd like to say, well, that's it, guys, that's a wrap. But, you know, critical points of failure. And one of the things that sticks in my mind was a guy we had on, Simon White. He's fantastic as well. He talks about the theory of constraints and blockages, right? And you mentioned this guy in the basement, old Richard, as a critical point of failure. One, he's trying to manage the throughput and obviously the WIP of work, the work in progress, but he's also a stuck point. And, you know, if Richard got sick or if something happened to Richard, that could affect your whole access, you know. So I'm wondering, a lot of projects still have this, and they're people of influence because they are critical points of failure. And I've certainly been ones in the past without realizing, but then I've, you know, in hindsight, oh yeah, if I left, that would be a problem. Dale's certainly been a critical point of failure, in a good way. How do we educate? What's the best way to kind of approach this problem set? Do you first identify key people of interest or influence, and then look at key people of interest who are also critical factors to, you know, impact the system as a whole? Or is it a separate kind of theory that you've read?
Yeah, it's I think about it as the power of connectivity, and it can't be resolved by me as an individual. As much, this is where I've got to shift from my ego to my eco, because I end up being a critical point of failure for at least a period of time when I'm just tearing apart the system a little bit and putting it back together. There's a moment there when no one knows what it is except for me. It's like, this is not a good place to be. I need to get to the place where everyone's back in and bought in. So for me, and it's in your personal life as well, I think these things use a similar concept, is we've got down to a world where we kind of just think about, you know, our direct partner and maybe our kids as being our little tight bundle, and that should give you everything you need in life and you should be completely resilient in that place. But actually that's a bit of a point of failure, because something goes wrong with that and you can end up feeling quite adrift. And I think this works in a work environment as well. It's so important to really reach out, to connect as much as you can, find your tribe, create relationships. And this is about creating the right environment within organizations that allow people time to become, like, have your support network. So yeah, you do need to go out and, to get your job done, you need to work with your frogs and all the various other people. You need a safe place to come back to. And actually by creating those sort of communities where each of you is playing a part, you can often step into each other's roles then, because you know about them, you know what they're doing, you're paying attention, you're leaning forward, you're there to support. Like, you're basically sitting as a backup to somebody. You're like, right, if you need a hand, I may not do it the same way as you, but I can at least fill this gap if I need to. On a pragmatic level, where it's your technical experts, that's where I get deeply concerned. So someone like me with a how-to, there's lots of how-tos that you could do. You could find lots of different pathways around, me disappearing, because you'll find another pathway. It may not be as efficient, or it may not be mine, but it's something. When you lose a key player like Richard, losing him would have been fundamental. There's other people I've worked with whose knowledge is extensive and fundamental. And I think that's where we've lost something in our industry, and it's slowly coming back, is the concept of the apprentice, where you get to, where you deliberately ensure that you have, on the same job that Richard was on, I had a brilliant guy who did a fabulous Elvis impersonation. But other than that, he also knew every single way you could take a possession on a railway. And
Nice.
he was phenomenal. Steve England, he was a legend. Absolutely. Well, he still is a legend.
Good on you, Steve.
Yeah, good on you, Steve. And my God, he saved my bacon, because he knew everything we needed to know about anything. And he's the only reason I could even pretend to be in the role I was in. But I just used to sit there thinking, what happens when there's no Steve? Like, where's Steve Jr.? They can plug in. And so partly I was Karen, who I work with, Karen Elson, who's an absolute legend in herself, does all the knowledge, the learning legacies. And she just launched the HS2 learning legacy. And I mean, what she does is part of the way to resolve this, is that she captures that knowledge. So you can't get all of it because you don't get it in context. But it is brilliant to be able to get this stuff down in a way that others can absorb it still, even if that person's not there. So there's an element of that where you capture as much as you can, the apprenticeship system, and then this resilience of, get people around you, share your knowledge, share your skills, get it written down, come on blogs, write, come on podcasts and write blogs. And one of the problems is the people who have the deepest knowledge just don't take the time to do things like this. Especially if they're creatives, the vulnerability of exposing yourself is really difficult. And so we only hear from the extroverts who are willing to come and share their knowledge. It's like that we're missing huge chunks. So, I mean, no matter how uncomfortable this makes you, it's not about you putting yourself forward. It's others hear what you have to say, and it either reinforces their knowledge or makes them think slightly differently or helps them understand something. So I think the sort of work you guys are doing is fundamental to creating some of that resilience.
Well, thank you. Appreciate those kind words. There's a lot to unpack there as well. And I know we are heading towards the end of the pod, Joe. But I just want to rewind slightly. You mentioned everything around, ego to eco and everything you're doing in that space. We did talk to Dr. Karen Thompson, Nigel Williams. I don't know if you're familiar with them, and Dave Corbin back on episode 73 around responsible project management. And they've got a charter. And if you're not aware of them, we can put you in touch. Maybe, you can collaborate to some extent, because they're in the education space. So working with universities, etc., for the pipeline of future project managers. So maybe there's something there. We can put you in touch, the mycelium.
Fabulous.
So we'll look to do that. But I also had an interesting thought when you're talking about politics and how it all works. And I don't watch a lot of television during the daytime, but the other day, just, working from home, had a bit of lunch and I put on the news, and just happened to be Prime Minister's questions in the UK. I thought, let me watch a bit of this. And it's hugely entertaining because it's quite theatrical. But I thought to myself, well, the Prime Minister, takes a lot of flack from all the opposition parties. And then he typically defends or attacks back. But what if he turned around and went, actually, you know what, that's a great idea. Why don't we work together? What would happen, right? Because I've never seen that happen. But what would actually happen? Because that's what we're actually trying to encourage our teams to do. When you have opposing views, invite it in, be curious about it and go, okay, maybe there is something to that. Maybe the sum of our parts is equal to something greater than the individual. But just going back to that, my thoughts were, well, if the general public are watching that, they're going, okay, that's how you lead, because that's obviously what we're seeing our leaders do. And I don't know if it's a great advertisement, but that's just my opinion. But let's not get into the politics. I do want to make a little bit of space for our feature. And without Martin here, who usually takes us through it, I will take us through it. So if you're ready, it's a little bit of fun near the end of the podcast. Our first one is called Defend the Indefensible. So it's inspired by ridiculous statements that we hear every single day. And we invite our guest, you, to defend it for 30 seconds, no more.
I'm not ready.
So if you're not ready, let's go.
You can do it. Let's
Right.
go.
Okay. So your statement to defend is, we need to take emotion out of project delivery.
Well, of course you do. I mean, seriously, why would you want to deal with emotions? They're messy, they're unorganized. You cannot put them in a reporting chart. Like, how are you supposed to say, oh, it was very emotional today? Should we say 3 people cried and 4 people went and had a scream and 2 gave a hug? Does that mean we're doing well as a project? I mean, seriously, how's anyone going to do anything if you're going to take emotions into account? I'm just flabbergasted that you even thought that we'd go down that pathway. Let's just get back to facts, 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 and facts. Maybe a bit of data if we're lucky.
Perfect.
Brilliant. You look like you really enjoyed that one as well.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Right. On to the next one then. It's called Fiverr, a quick pop quiz, all about yourself. So if you're ready, 5 questions. Number 1, early mornings or late nights?
Oh, early mornings.
Question
Definitely.
2, what are the 3 must-have behaviors you look for in successful project teams?
Trust. I'll go for a Brené Brown one, a bit of vulnerability and authenticity. Keep it real.
Awesome. Nice. Question 3, what is the best book you've been gifted?
Braiding Sweetgrass is the most phenomenal book. I'm going to forget her name, Kimar. Oh, I can't think what her last name is, but a wonderful combination of Native American history or ancestry with a scientific background. And so therefore looking at Indigenous ways from a scientist's point of view, which actually just makes sense of things that have been learned from a practical point of view, but actually do get backed up by science, plus also wonderfully lyrical and just very real and in touch with nature.
Wow. Wow. Check that one out, folks. Question 4, what is the biggest mistake you've made on a project?
There's just too many to count.
Just the biggest one.
I think the biggest issues I've had have been to hold my ground almost as a point of ego. So just digging in, using my intellect to, and my powers of persuasion to stick to my guns and not actually taking the time to hear what was happening on the other side of the table. And then ending up in a contractual warfare where so many letters, he tells you how long ago this one was, but letters going back and forth until basically you had to sit there and have the discussion of, should we just go 50-50 on the bills? I was like, oh my God, I should have just let go. Like, seriously, why was I working so hard to not be wrong? I was so needed to know and be the.
Such important lessons in that. Thanks for sharing. Question 5, if you could choose one person to be stuck in a lift with, who would it be and why?
I'd have to be, oh gosh, I'll get in trouble. It's my daughters, but I can choose either one. Actually would be perfect. I won't choose which one, but they're always a really good laugh and we'll definitely have a great conversation and I get lots of hugs in the meantime, so
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, we got to give another shout out to Jonathan Norman for putting you in touch with us.
Thanks, Jono.
We owe Jono a massive gift, Val, because he's put so many amazing guests in touch with us. I think this whole series, has been a Jono Norman series. It's fantastic. But Joe, before we let you go, we have to have you back because there's so much we haven't uncovered with you. Are there any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Oh, well, I'd be very pleased to be back. This is great fun. I think just we'll send out some information about Ego to Eco. One of the things is you can fill in a card, which is effectively your Ego to Eco statement of what wouldn't it be amazing to do, and what you commit to. I'd love for as many people as possible to fill that in. We need to hear the hidden voices. If you're the least likely person to fill that in, please fill it in. We want to hear from you. There's a good chance there's something sitting in the back of your brain that is part of the solution. It doesn't need to be big. It doesn't need to save the world in one go. We do this in small steps, but we need to do the small steps together.
Awesome. Fantastic. And yeah, get us those links. We'll post them in the show notes. It'll go out with the podcast. And yeah, folks, do get in touch with Joe and fill out that link as well. Val, any final thoughts from you?
Oh, Joe, I think, yeah, you definitely have to come back as our resident guest on all sorts of things. I mean, we covered so many different topics in one conversation, but I love the element of ego to eco. And also I think find your tribe for anyone listening out there, you know, get into those communities of interest, have a voice, find your superpower. Fantastic advice, Joe. Thanks for having you. Thanks for being on the show. Actually, I really appreciate it.
No, appreciate being here. Thank you very much. Really nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's been amazing. Thank you, Joe. That's all the time we have, folks. Remember to hit subscribe before you go. And a massive thank you once again to our guest, Joe Lucas. And thank you all for listening. Till next time, we say stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. From me and Val, it's bye for now.